Almost 500 people were killed in Boston's Cocoanut Grove nightclub fire in November of 1942. The event has left a mark that goes far beyond its time and place, with lessons for public safety that always have to be reinforced. To tell us about an event to mark the fire's 75th anniversary are two officers from the Cocoanut Grove Memorial Committee, Mike Hanlon and Dr. Ken Marshall. I'd like to thank you both very much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you.
I want to start with Mike, because one of the reasons this fire reverberated with people so much in Boston is not just because of the catastrophe, the fatalities, but the way this brought together these different parts of Boston society. Talk about that.
Yeah, this was a nightclub noted to be the number one nightclub in the city, and it was formed by two entertainers at the time in 1927. And they were performing on a summer routine up at a resort in Maine. And they were expressing their dreams about owning a nightclub. And a stranger was sitting at the next table who said, "I'm very interested and I would help to fund that." Well, what they didn't know is that he was somebody who pulled off a $100 million stock scam in Los Angeles, so he was looking to unload money. He did finance the club, and the club survived for a few years under the Depression and then later on Prohibition, but they gave up the club just because financially it wasn't doing well. And Charles King Solomon, who was the leading gangster in Boston, he ended up purchasing the club, and he had ties to the Jewish mafia, if you will, in New York, who had control of many of the entertainers in New York City. And as a result of that relationship, you had the likes of Sophie Tucker, Jimmy Durante, and other top entertainers from New York coming to the Cocoanut Grove. So even during Prohibition, the club was just booming. And until King Solomon finally met his fate. And the Cotton Club, which was located on Tremont Street, and he was there one evening in an after-hours event, and 3 or 4 guys ended up plugging him to death.
Right. And the night of the fire at Cocoanut Grove, there's supposed to be people celebrating the expected victory of Boston College over Holy Cross.
Boston College was the #1 football team in the country, undefeated, playing their Catholic arch rivals, Holy Cross, who had a 500 record. And kind of ironic is on the program of the football game were the co-captains of BC, one of which was Mike Holloway, who came and played for coached the Boston Patriots. Holloway's number was 12, his co-captain's number was 55, and that happened to be the score of the game, Holy Cross 55 and BC 12.
Dr. Marshall, your connection is that when the catastrophe happened, your mother was one of the responders. Tell us about that.
She was. Well, first of all, I was 4, and I remember my dad owned, we lived in Medford, and my dad owned a pharmacy, so he had to close the store to stay home to take care of me because she did not return home for 4 days. And she had graduated from the City Hospital Nursing School and stayed working there right through the fire and actually afterwards. And she actually ended up taking care of the person who was sort of the poster boy for the fire, Clifford Johnson, along with 4 other nurses, but she never got over the whole experience and had PTSD from it, which brings me to some of the medical issues that came out of this fire. And her longest memory was of the bodies lined up in rows in the parking lot, all looking like they were just stepping out for the evening because they died of asphyxiation rather than from burns. A little bit of a nuance and difference from the more recent station fire 15 years ago in Warwick, Rhode Island, where many patients actually died of their burns. The Cocoanut Grove, some indeed did, but many of them died from inhalation injuries, and that was one of the major advances that came out of the fire medically. There were 5 major advances, and that was certainly one of them. But the other 4, just since we're talking about that, it revolutionized burn care. Oliver Cope and Brad Cannon at the General really revolutionized how we took care of burns, and in fact, we're still using many of their techniques. And then, of course, the inhalation injury was dealt with by Sam Levinson, who became the chief eventually down in New York at Einstein. And he developed a mask that was used in World War II, and he was quite a bright guy, but he insisted on early intervention of inhalation injuries. And many of these patients walked into the emergency rooms that night. There were 300 at the city and 120 or so at the Mass General. And out of that 420 people in the first hours, that all happened in 75 minutes, which was an incredible amount of triage troubles. But by the time the third day rolled around, there were only 32 left at the Mass General and probably 98 left at the city. So it really took a terrible toll. And then the other three major advances, one of them is almost apocryphal, and it's one of the reasons we're pursuing, well, there are many reasons we're pursuing a permanent memorial, but it was the first in the civilian world use of penicillin in the entire world was used for this fire. And then the first blood bank ever established in a hospital in the world was established as Mass General by Dr. Beamy Suter, who I knew quite well later on. He became the dean at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, but he established the first blood bank and at the Mass General. And then finally, we always associate, and I'm a Vietnam veteran, but we always associate the Vietnam War with PTSD, and surely it played a huge role. However, the very first paper ever written about PTSD was written about this fire by a woman named Alexandra Adler, who was an immigrant from Austria and whose father was a psychiatrist and somebody who was a colleague of Freud's in Vienna. And she wrote the first paper 5 months after the fire about the fire. She called it the neuropsychiatric disorder from trauma.
Mike, what about this poster boy, Clifford Johnson?
Yeah. Ken could respond, but Clifford Johnson was at Mass General for just about a year being treated. City Hospital, sorry, for about a year, and was able to walk out of the hospital. In fact, I believe he married a woman who was a nurse at Boston City Hospital. And the ironic tragedy was he later moved back to Missouri, became a park ranger, and was involved in a automobile accident, which he was trapped in the car. The gas tank blew, and he burned to death.
He was the most extensive surviving burn injury of the Coconut Grove fire. He had a 75% burn, which a full thickness burn, which is way past the LD50 for burn survival at that time and even now. And it took, as Mike said, a year, and then he had therapy with it. He had basically 5 nurses, and he became addicted. Now that we're in this era of opioid addiction, he was addicted and was a very nasty person when he was on opioids. But my mother told me that he actually was a very sweet guy when he got off the opioids. And he married one of her colleagues.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Mike Hanlon and Dr. Ken Marshall from the Cocoanut Grove Memorial Committee. Mike, you've got an event coming up November 25th. We're going to have some officials, including some fire safety officials, talking. Explain what you've got planned for that.
4 years ago, our group, we were able to petition the City of Boston to rename a street to cut through the footprint of the Cocoanut Grove to Coconut Grove Lane. And in the ensuing 4 years, we've stayed together with the idea that we would organize a memorial for the 75th anniversary of the fire. So we've done that, and Mayor Marty Walsh is one of our speakers, as well as at least one survivor of the fire is also one of our speakers. The police commissioner, the fire commissioner, a number of physicians who have ties to Mass General, the Shriners Hospital, and we have a number of folks whose either loved ones perished in the fire or family members who may have survived the fire, and hopefully that they will also give us a very brief, but as one of them said, this is an opportunity for me to have closure for the loss that she endured.
This is going to take place at the location.
It's taking place actually. The Revere Hotel is actually built directly over a good part of the footprint of the club. And actually the room that we're actually having this anniversary memorial is actually over the ballroom of the Coconut Grove fire. So and we thought that was very appropriate to be right at the exact site.
Well, we've had these medical advances since the fire. We've had reforms, I'm sure, in building and safety code. But why is it so important to keep reminding people about this?
Because we have the station fire, the Oakland warehouse fire of a year ago, in many ways was a bit of a replay, inadequate exits, overcrowded materials, shoddy building materials, and unfortunately, one of the fire officials of the city of Boston, an auxiliary fire chief and a former fire marshal, Jay Fleming, who was on a panel with me last year with the American Burn Association about the Cocoanut Grove fire, he insists that the biggest problem with these fires is that the public officials are not learning the lessons from the Cocoanut Grove, that if indeed they extrapolated the lessons, we wouldn't have had many of these others. And there have been fires in New York that have killed 80, a fire in Kentucky that killed 80, and also outside the United States, where Fleming argues, well, their safety codes are different from ours. However, 250 people, mostly medical students, died in a very similar situation with locked doors and flammable materials in a nightclub in Brazil about 5 years ago, and one just 2 years ago in Romania. So the world has not taken the lessons from this, and one of our chief goals is to make sure however we memorialize this, and we're sort of the last generation that has a direct contact, that this be a learning experience that perhaps another station fire won't happen if somebody reads and understands.
And Mike, finally, the time of the event and your website so people can get some details?
Yes, it's, pardon me, this event will take place on Saturday, November 25 at the Revere Hotel, 200 Stewart Street, from 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock, and we certainly invite the public to come and join us. One of our members, Zach Miller, has produced a documentary that he'll be showing on that afternoon. And I'm sorry, what was the other part?
Just the time that things get started for
From
this.
1 to 3.
1 to 3. It'll probably run later because we have so many interested speakers and interesting speakers.
Yes, it's a good program. Thank you very much for being with us.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mike Hanlon and Dr. Ken Marshall from the Cocoanut Grove Memorial Committee.